She gave birth on a dirt floor in a blizzard with nothing but a candle and a midwife's saddlebag full of painkillers, rusty scissors, and string. On the frontier, childbirth wasn't beautiful. It was bloody, breathless survival. Women fought to bring life into a world where hospitals didn't exist, and not every man welcomed the baby he came home to. Today, we reveal 9 brutal truths about giving birth in the Wild West. From deadly winters to desperate remedies, and the dark choices families were forced to make. Number 9, the traveling midwife's saddlebag of horrors. The Wild West had its own version of emergency medical kits, but nothing could prepare you for what frontier midwives carried in their worn leather saddlebags. These brave women rode through hostile territory with collections of tools that would make modern doctors cringe. Yet these crude instruments often meant the difference between life and death on the unforgiving frontier. Picture this: a weathered saddlebag containing rusty scissors for cutting umbilical cords, bottles of whiskey that served as both anesthetic and antiseptic, and leather straps for women to bite down on during the worst pain. But here's what most people don't know. These midwives also carried specialized frontier tools that you've probably never heard of, each one telling a story of desperate innovation in the face of medical isolation. The birth spoon was a crude wooden instrument used to help deliver breech babies, often carved by the midwife herself from whatever wood was available. These weren't delicate medical instruments. They were rough-hewn tools, shaped by calloused hands using nothing but a hunting knife and sandpaper. Some midwives spent their entire careers perfecting the curve and smoothness of these spoons, knowing that the right shape could save both mother and child. Even more dangerous were the small glass bottles filled with powdered ergot, a fungus that grew on rye grain. This substance could speed up labor by causing powerful uterine contractions, but the dosage had to be perfect. Too little, and it was useless. Too much, and it would cause convulsions that killed the mother within hours. Midwives learned to measure ergot using fingernail clippings as measuring spoons, a technique passed down through generations of frontier women who had no access to proper medical scales. The most experienced midwives kept tiny vials of laudanum, liquid opium, hidden in secret compartments of their saddlebags. This powerful painkiller was often the only thing that could help a woman survive the agony of prolonged labor, but it was also highly addictive and potentially fatal. Smart midwives never let families know they carried it, as desperate people would sometimes rob or even kill for access to opium. But perhaps the most crucial items in these saddlebags were the lengths of boiled string and strips of clean cloth. In an era when infection killed more new mothers than difficult births, cleanliness was literally a matter of life and death. Experienced midwives would boil their string and cloth supplies at every opportunity, often carrying small pots specifically for sterilization purposes. The tools also included strange items that served multiple purposes: turkey feathers for clearing airways in newborns, knitting needles for various medical procedures, and even small mirrors that could be used to check for breathing in seemingly stillborn babies. Some midwives carried tiny glass thermometers, precious items that cost more than most families earned in a month. But here's the most heartbreaking reality. These midwives often traveled for days to reach a woman in labor, riding through dangerous territory where bandits, hostile natives, and wild animals posed constant threats. Many learned to identify the signs of impending birth from miles away: smoke signals from desperate families, or the urgent galloping of a husband's horse in the distance. By the time they arrived, they often found women who had been in labor for days, sometimes finding only tragedy waiting for them. The survival rate of mothers attended by these traveling midwives was still only about 60%, but without them, it would have been far worse. These women were the unsung heroes of frontier expansion, carrying death and salvation in equal measure within their leather saddlebags. And this is just the beginning of the shocking realities that frontier women faced during childbirth. Number 8, the mysterious birth chairs of the frontier. Now here's something that will surprise even history buffs: the frontier birth chair. These weren't ordinary pieces of furniture. They were specialized contraptions designed specifically for childbirth. And they were far more common in the Wild West than you might imagine. What makes these chairs so fascinating is that they represent one of the most successful medical innovations of the frontier period. Yet most people today have never heard of them. The typical frontier birth chair looked like a regular wooden chair with one crucial difference. It had a horseshoe-shaped hole cut out of the seat. This design allowed gravity to assist in the birth process while giving the attending midwife or family member easier access to help deliver the baby. But the engineering behind these chairs was far more sophisticated than their simple appearance suggested. Experienced frontier carpenters learned to angle the seat at precisely the right degree, usually between 15 and 20 degrees, to optimize the birthing position. The armrests were positioned to provide maximum leverage for the laboring woman, allowing her to grip and push more effectively. The height was carefully calculated so that attendants could work without straining their backs during what could be hours of intensive labor assistance. But these chairs held dark secrets that tell the story of frontier survival in heartbreaking detail. Many were carved with strange symbols and notches that documented every birth they'd witnessed. A notch on the right armrest meant a successful delivery of a healthy baby, while a notch on the left marked when either mother or child didn't survive. Some chairs accumulated dozens of these marks over their lifetimes, becoming grim scorecards of frontier survival that told stories of triumph and tragedy spanning decades. The most haunting detail? These chairs were often passed down through families and communities, carrying with them the accumulated pain and hope of generations. Women would labor in the same chair their mothers and grandmothers had used, sitting in seats worn smooth by the grip of countless hands during the most desperate moments of their lives. The wood itself became a repository of generational memory, soaked with the tears, sweat, and blood of women who faced death to bring life into the harsh frontier world. Some families became so attached to their birth chairs that they carried them across thousands of miles during westward migrations, refusing to abandon these crucial pieces of survival equipment, even when space and weight were critical concerns. Wagon trains would sometimes delay departures to accommodate pregnant women who insisted on bringing their family's birth chair, understanding that this piece of furniture might mean the difference between life and death for both mother and child. The construction of these chairs varied dramatically based on available materials and local carpentry skills. Wealthy frontier families might commission chairs made from oak or walnut with intricate carvings and cushioned armrests. Poor homesteaders made theirs from whatever wood they could find, sometimes even using driftwood or salvaged lumber from abandoned buildings. Despite these differences in quality, the basic design remained remarkably consistent across thousands of miles of frontier territory. Some chairs included ingenious modifications that increased their effectiveness. Grooves carved into the armrests could hold essential supplies within easy reach. Small shelves attached to the sides provided space for clean cloths, medical instruments, and emergency supplies. A few enterprising carpenters even created chairs with adjustable back angles, allowing women to find the most comfortable position as labor progressed. The psychological importance of these chairs cannot be overstated. In a world where so much was uncertain and dangerous, the birth chair represented stability, tradition, and hope. Women found comfort in using the same chair where their relatives had successfully given birth, drawing strength from the knowledge that others had survived this ordeal in the same spot. But these traditional methods weren't always enough when complications arose. Number 7, the granny women and their secret remedies. Despite what movies show, most frontier births weren't attended by doctors or even trained midwives. Instead, communities relied on granny women, elderly females who'd learned birth techniques through decades of experience and word-of-mouth knowledge passed down through generations. These remarkable women possessed an arsenal of secret remedies that sound more like witchcraft than medicine, but many were surprisingly effective and formed the backbone of frontier medical care. The granny women were living libraries of medical knowledge, carrying in their minds hundreds of remedies, techniques, and procedures that had been tested and refined over generations of frontier births. They knew which herbs could stop bleeding, which roots could ease pain, and which concoctions could prevent infection in an era before antibiotics. This knowledge was passed down through oral tradition, with each granny woman adding her own discoveries and modifications to the collective wisdom. Red raspberry leaf tea was one of their most important remedies, brewed to strengthen the uterus during labor and reduce the risk of hemorrhaging. Modern medical research has confirmed that raspberry leaves contain fragarine, a compound that does indeed strengthen uterine muscles. The granny women didn't know the scientific explanation, but they knew it worked, and they guarded their preparation methods jealously. Cohosh root was another crucial remedy, used to speed up contractions that had stalled during labor. Blue cohosh was preferred for starting labor, while black cohosh was used to strengthen weak contractions. The dosage was critical. Too little was ineffective, while too much could cause dangerous overstimulation of the uterus. Experienced granny women learned to judge the correct amount by observing the mother's condition and the progress of labor. Wild ginger helped combat nausea during difficult labors, while slippery elm bark was chewed to create a natural lubricant that could ease the passage of the baby during delivery. Willow bark was ground into powder and mixed with water to create a pain-relieving drink that contained natural compounds similar to modern aspirin. The most closely guarded secret was birth bark, a mixture of willow bark, cherry bark, and other plants that created a powerful natural painkiller. But the granny women's knowledge extended far beyond herbal remedies. They practiced positioning techniques that modern obstetrics has only recently rediscovered as beneficial. They knew how to use gravity to assist difficult births by having women squat, kneel, or hang from ropes during labor. They understood the importance of keeping the mother upright and moving, rather than lying flat on her back, as was common in formal medical practice of the time. The psychological aspect of their care was equally important. Granny women provided emotional support and reassurance that could mean the difference between a successful birth and a tragedy. They knew how to calm panicked mothers, encourage exhausted women to keep pushing, and provide the confidence that was crucial for successful labor. Their presence alone often had a calming effect that helped births progress more smoothly. These women also practiced techniques that seem bizarre today but often saved lives. They would massage the mother's belly with animal fat mixed with herbs, believing it would help the baby slide out easier. They positioned laboring women in specific ways, based on the phases of the moon, thinking celestial timing affected birth outcomes. While the lunar beliefs were superstitious, the massage and positioning techniques often did help. The granny women maintained detailed mental records of every birth they attended, creating an accumulated database of what worked and what didn't. They could recognize danger signs that others missed, knowing when to attempt interventions and when to simply provide comfort during inevitable tragedies. Their success rates were often better than formally trained doctors of the time, primarily because they focused on supporting natural birth processes rather than interfering with them. But here's what's truly remarkable. Modern medical research has validated many of these frontier remedies. Scientists have discovered that several plants used by granny women contain compounds that actually do help with labor pain, bleeding control, and infection prevention. However, not every remedy was helpful, and some were downright dangerous. Which brings us to our next shocking revelation. If these untold stories of frontier life fascinate you as much as they do us, tap that like button. It tells us you want more raw, unfiltered history. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and join us for more deep dives into the hidden truths of the Wild West. Number 6. The nightmare of winter births. If you think childbirth in the Wild West was challenging under normal circumstances, imagine giving birth during a frontier winter when temperatures plummeted below zero and blizzards could trap families for weeks at a time. Winter births represented one of the most terrifying scenarios that frontier families could face, combining all the normal dangers of childbirth with environmental conditions that could kill within hours. When labor began during a snowstorm, there was absolutely no possibility of summoning help from the outside world. No midwife could travel through deep snow and howling winds that could kill a person within minutes of exposure. No doctor could make the journey from distant towns when roads became impassable and landmarks disappeared under blankets of white. No neighbor could risk their own life to assist when venturing outside meant almost certain death from exposure or getting lost in whiteout conditions. The physical environment inside frontier cabins during winter was brutal for childbirth. These structures were poorly insulated, with gaps between logs that let in frigid air and snow. Temperatures often dropped below freezing inside the cabin during the worst storms, even with fires burning constantly. Women labored in conditions where their breath formed clouds in the air, and any exposed skin quickly became numb with cold. The physical stress of shivering and fighting hypothermia made labor more difficult and exhausting. Newborn babies faced an even more dire situation. Within minutes of birth, infants could develop hypothermia that would kill them before they could be properly warmed. Families would heat stones in fireplaces and wrap them in whatever cloth they had, creating makeshift warming systems that often failed when fuel ran low or fires died out. Some families would take turns holding newborns against their own bodies, sharing body heat in desperate attempts to keep babies alive through their first crucial hours. The lack of fresh water created another life-threatening crisis. Snow had to be melted for cleaning wounds, washing hands, and sterilizing crude medical instruments. But fuel was precious and often running critically low by late winter. This meant births took place in increasingly unsanitary conditions, with dirty instruments and contaminated cloth as the only available supplies. Families had to choose between using their limited fuel to heat the cabin or to boil water for medical purposes. Food shortages during harsh winters meant mothers were often severely malnourished and physically weakened before labor even began. Their bodies lacked the strength and nutrients needed for the enormous physical demands of childbirth, leading to prolonged labors that exhausted both mother and baby. Malnourished mothers also had difficulty producing adequate breast milk, creating another survival crisis for newborns who needed immediate nutrition. The psychological pressure was equally devastating. Families knew that if complications arose, there would be no rescue, no medical intervention, and no help coming until spring. This knowledge created panic and despair that made difficult labors even more dangerous. Women would sometimes labor for days in these conditions, with family members taking turns staying awake to monitor their condition and keep fires burning. Some families developed ingenious cold weather survival techniques that actually worked. They would heat large stones in the fireplace and place them around the mother to create warm zones during labor. Others would hang heavy blankets and furs around the birth area to create insulated spaces that trapped body heat more effectively. The most resourceful families would prepare special winter birth kits months in advance, stockpiling extra fuel, clean cloth, preserved foods, and medical supplies. Communication during winter storms was nearly impossible, but some families developed emergency signaling systems using smoke or fire patterns that could sometimes be seen by distant neighbors during brief breaks in the weather. A few communities established winter emergency caches, supply stations stocked with medical supplies and fuel that could be reached even in bad weather. But winter births also created some of the most incredible survival stories in frontier history, including techniques that seem impossible but actually worked. Number 5, the terrifying reality of breech births. In modern hospitals, breech births, where babies are born feet or bottom first instead of head first, are routinely handled with cesarean sections performed by skilled surgical teams in sterile operating rooms. But on the frontier, a breech birth was often a death sentence for both mother and child, representing one of the most feared complications that could arise during labor. The techniques used to handle these emergencies were both ingenious and terrifying, born from desperation and refined through tragic experience. Breech presentations occur in approximately 3 to 4% of all pregnancies, but on the frontier, where prenatal care was non-existent and the baby's position was unknown until labor began, families were often caught completely unprepared for this complication. The first sign was usually when labor progressed normally until the pushing stage. But instead of a baby's head appearing, feet or buttocks would emerge first. This moment struck terror into the hearts of attendants who knew they were facing a life or death emergency with no medical backup available. Frontier midwives and granny women developed techniques for handling breech deliveries that were both ingenious and terrifying, passed down through generations of women who had faced these crises. The most common approach involved a combination of positioning, manual manipulation, and sheer determination to try to either turn the baby or deliver it safely in breech position. These techniques required incredible skill and nerve, as one wrong move could kill both mother and child. The most widespread technique involves suspending the mother in various positions using ropes and pulleys attached to cabin rafters, believing that gravity and positioning could help turn the baby or ease the delivery. Women would be positioned hanging upside down, suspended at various angles, or held in specific positions by multiple attendants. While this sounds primitive, modern obstetrics has confirmed that certain positions can indeed help with breech deliveries. When positioning failed, some experienced midwives would attempt external version, manually manipulating the baby from outside the mother's belly to try to turn it into the correct position. This required tremendous skill and experience to avoid causing internal injuries or wrapping the umbilical cord around the baby's neck. Even more dangerous was internal version, where the midwife would reach inside the birth canal and attempt to manually turn the baby or manipulate its position during delivery. The most dangerous technique was called extraction, where attendants would grasp whatever part of the baby was accessible and attempt to pull it out. This required precise knowledge of anatomy and incredible delicacy, as pulling too hard or in the wrong direction could cause internal injuries, broken bones, or death. Experienced midwives learned to support the baby's body properly and to time their assistance with the mother's contractions. When these techniques failed, the frontier solution was brutally pragmatic and reflected the harsh realities of survival in isolated conditions. If the baby was clearly dying and continuing, the labor would kill the mother. They would focus entirely on saving the mother's life. This sometimes involved the horrific procedure of removing the baby piece by piece, using whatever instruments were available. If the mother was dying but the baby might survive, they would attempt to save the baby through crude surgical procedures that usually killed the mother. The survival statistics for breech births were absolutely horrifying and reflected the extreme dangers of frontier childbirth. Historical records suggest that fewer than half of breech babies survived these deliveries, and maternal mortality rates were even worse. In some frontier communities, breech presentation was considered such a certain death sentence that families would begin mourning as soon as the complication was discovered. However, the stories of successful breech deliveries became legendary in frontier communities, and midwives who successfully handled them gained almost mythical reputations. These women were summoned from incredible distances when breech births occurred, and their techniques were studied and copied by other attendants. Some granny women claimed to be able to predict breech presentations weeks before birth by feeling the mother's belly, though their methods were more superstition than science. But even successful deliveries led to challenges that could kill days or weeks later. Number 4. The hidden killer, childbed fever. Here's a brutal truth that Hollywood never shows. Many frontier women who survived childbirth died days or weeks later from what was called childbed fever, infections that ravaged their bodies when there were no antibiotics to fight back. Childbed fever was caused by bacteria entering the birth canal during delivery, often from contaminated hands, instruments, or cloth, in an era when the connection between cleanliness and infection wasn't understood. These deadly bacteria spread unchecked through the mother's reproductive system and into her bloodstream. The symptoms were unmistakable and terrifying. A few days after a seemingly successful birth, the mother would develop a high fever, chills, and severe abdominal pain. Her body would begin to swell, and a foul-smelling discharge would indicate that infection was spreading rapidly. Without antibiotics, death was almost certain. Frontier families watched helplessly as new mothers who had survived the dangers of labor succumbed to this invisible killer. The mortality rate from childbed fever was staggering. Some frontier communities lost up to 30% of new mothers to these post-birth infections. The most heartbreaking aspect was that childbed fever was often caused by well-meaning helpers who didn't understand how infections spread. A midwife who'd helped deliver a calf earlier that day, a family member who'd been tending sick animals, or even a loving husband with dirty hands could unknowingly introduce the bacteria that would kill a new mother. Some frontier communities developed their own theories about preventing childbed fever, leading to both helpful and harmful practices that saved some lives while costing others. Number 3. The horrifying truth about multiple births. If a single birth was dangerous in the Wild West, imagine the terror of discovering you were carrying twins, triplets, or even more babies. Multiple births were often death sentences for entire families, creating challenges that even the most experienced frontier midwives couldn't handle. The first problem was that multiple pregnancies were rarely detected until labor began. Without medical imaging or sophisticated prenatal care, most families didn't know they were expecting more than one baby until the first child was born, and labor continued. This lack of preparation meant that families had insufficient supplies, inadequate help, and no time to prepare for the additional challenges. Multiple births exhausted mothers beyond their ability to recover. The physical demands of delivering several babies consecutively, often with complications like breech presentations or umbilical cord problems, left mothers too weak to survive the blood loss and physical trauma. But the cruel mathematics of frontier survival made multiple births devastating even when the mothers survived. Families struggling to feed one additional mouth suddenly faced feeding 2, 3, or more hungry infants. With limited food supplies and no commercial baby formula, mothers often couldn't produce enough milk for multiple babies. The result was heartbreaking choices that no family should ever face. Historical records contain tragic accounts of families forced to choose which babies to try to save when they couldn't feed them all. Some families would attempt to find wet nurses for some babies while keeping others. Others made arrangements with neighboring families to adopt some children. The survival rate for multiple births was catastrophically low. Some frontier communities went years without seeing twins survive to their first birthday, and triplets were considered almost certain death sentences. Yet some multiple birth families developed innovations that actually worked, creating techniques that modern medicine would later adopt. Number 2, the brutal mathematics of frontier survival. Now for the most heartbreaking truth about frontier childbirth, the devastating mathematics of survival that forced families to make impossible decisions about life and death. Historical records reveal that maternal mortality rates in some frontier areas exceeded 30%, meaning that nearly 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or from related complications. Infant mortality was even worse, with some communities losing more than half of all babies born. These weren't just statistics. They were brutal realities that shaped every aspect of frontier life. Families knew that pregnancy was likely to result in tragedy, yet children were essential for survival in harsh frontier conditions. This created a terrible cycle where families needed children to survive, but having children might kill the mothers who were equally essential for family survival. The mathematical reality led to practices that seem heartless today, but were based on cold survival calculations. Families often delayed naming babies until they survived their first winter, knowing that emotional attachment to children who might die was a luxury they couldn't afford. Some frontier communities developed informal agreements about distributing children from families that suffered parental deaths. These weren't legal adoptions, but survival arrangements that ensured children weren't simply abandoned when tragedy struck. The most devastating aspect was how these survival calculations affected women's choices about pregnancy. Many frontier women attempted dangerous and often fatal methods to prevent or end pregnancies, knowing that another birth might kill them and leave their existing children orphaned. The pressure on women to continue bearing children, despite the obvious dangers, created psychological trauma that lasted generations, affecting not just individual families, but entire frontier communities. But despite these horrific odds, some frontier women developed survival strategies that were nothing short of miraculous. Who knew childbirth in the Wild West was this intense? If you've got thoughts, questions, or even family stories about ancestors who lived through this, share them in the comments. We love hearing your insights, and we might feature your comment in a future video. And don't forget to subscribe and be part of our community of frontier history enthusiasts. Number 1. The unbelievable survival stories that defy logic. Here's the most incredible truth about frontier childbirth. Despite every obstacle, danger, and challenge we've discussed, some women not only survived, but thrived, developing techniques and building communities that preserved life against impossible odds. Take the story of Sarah McKinney, who gave birth to 11 children in a remote Montana homestead between 1867 and 1884. She lost only one child, developed her own birthing techniques, and eventually became the unofficial midwife for a territory covering hundreds of square miles. Her handwritten manual on frontier childbirth saved countless lives and was copied and distributed throughout the region. Then there's the remarkable case of the Sisterhood of the Saddlebag, a group of women who rode circuit routes throughout Wyoming Territory, providing childbirth assistance to isolated homesteads. These women, most of whom had lost children or nearly died in childbirth themselves, created an informal medical system that operated more effectively than official medical services. The most astounding survival story involves the 1878 blizzard that trapped the Morrison family for 6 weeks, while Emma Morrison was 9 months pregnant. With no outside help possible, her 3 daughters, aged 12, 14, and 16, successfully delivered their baby brother using techniques they'd learned by watching previous births. All 4 family members survived, and the baby grew up to become a territorial judge. Perhaps most incredible was the innovation of birth houses, specially constructed cabins designed specifically for childbirth that some communities built despite their limited resources. These structures included features like specialized ventilation, built-in warming systems, and storage areas for medical supplies. Some birth houses served their communities for decades, with their design improvements being copied throughout frontier territories. The survival strategies developed by frontier women were so effective that many are being rediscovered by modern medical professionals. Techniques for positioning during labor, natural pain management, and post-birth care that frontier women developed through necessity are now being taught in modern birthing classes. Which of these brutal truths about frontier childbirth surprised you the most? Have you heard family stories about ancestors who survived these challenges? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing about the incredible survival stories that run through frontier families. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of survival and innovation that shaped the American frontier, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. There are so many more shocking truths about frontier life that challenge everything we think we know about the Wild West. Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of the most dangerous and heroic chapters in American history.